The Battle of Singapore stands as one of the most dramatic and consequential military confrontations of the Second World War. A clash that not only shattered the myth of British invincibility in Asia, but forever altered the geopolitical destiny of the region. To understand why Singapore, a small island at the tip of the Malay Peninsula, became the stage for one of history's most stunning military upsets, one must grasp its symbolic and strategic weight in the early 20th century. It was not merely a colonial port, but the crown jewel of Britain's Eastern Empire, a fortress long touted as impregnable, a bastion meant to deter any threat from the rising powers of the Pacific. For decades, the British Empire had assured its people and its Asian subjects that Singapore was a fortress protected by modern naval bases, coastal artillery, and well-trained imperial troops. Yet beneath the polished facade of confidence lay a dangerous over-reliance on outdated assumptions about warfare, climate, enemy capabilities, and the nature of empire itself. By the time the hungry, battle-hardened Japanese 25th Army began sweeping down the Malayan Peninsula in December 1941, the British High Command still clung to the belief that any invasion would come by sea, not through dense jungles and overland routes that they considered impassable. This confidence, bordering on complacency, would prove catastrophic. The Japanese, exploiting speed, surprise, and an acute understanding of British weaknesses, launched a lightning campaign that stunned even their own generals with its success. In just weeks, the vaunted defenses of Malaya crumbled under relentless airstrikes, swift infantry movements on bicycles, and coordinated armored thrusts that outmaneuvered British, Australian, Indian, and local forces. By early February 1942, the British had been pushed back across the causeway, retreating to Singapore Island, their so-called Gibraltar of the East, where they hoped to finally hold the line. Yet what awaited them there was not salvation, but the prelude to disaster. As tens of thousands of Allied soldiers streamed into Singapore alongside terrified civilians fleeing the Japanese advance, panic spread through a city previously accustomed to the rhythms of trade, colonial administration, and confident cosmopolitan life. Air raids became constant. Bombs shattered homes, churches, markets, and military depots alike, sending thick plumes of smoke into skies once filled with the hum of commerce. The psychological shock was immense. Many Singaporeans had believed, up to the last moment, that the British Navy would arrive with overwhelming firepower, sweeping aside the Japanese fleet and restoring order. But the sinking of HMS Prince of Wales and HMS Repulse in December 1941, without a single aircraft of their own to defend them, had already signaled that no such rescue would come. Instead, British and Commonwealth troops, many inexperienced and inadequately trained for jungle warfare, now faced an enemy who possessed air superiority, relentless momentum, and a command structure determined to secure a rapid victory. The Japanese campaign was characterized by bold crossings, flank attacks through mangrove swamps, infiltration tactics, and a ruthless exploitation of confusion in British ranks. On the island itself, the Japanese artillery pounded strategic positions daily, their shells landing deeper and more accurately as they seized high ground to the north. British forces, stretched thin and hampered by conflicting leadership decisions, struggled to form a cohesive defense. Lieutenant General Arthur Percival, commander of British forces in Malaya, faced the impossible task of defending a long and porous perimeter with troops suffering exhaustion, equipment shortages, and wavering morale. His opponents, especially the formidable General Tomoyuki Yamashita, wielded not only tactical aggression but psychological warfare, deliberately projecting the illusion of greater strength than they actually possessed. As water supplies dwindled, civilian casualties mounted, and Japanese infiltration tightened around key reservoirs, the island's defenses collapsed with shocking speed. The once assured messages proclaiming the defense of Singapore now turned into desperate communiques urging troops to hold positions that were rapidly becoming untenable. Fires raged across the city as fuel depots ignited. Hospitals overflowed with wounded soldiers and civilians. Food became scarce. Communications fell into disarray. The smell of smoke, sweat, and fear filled the humid air. In the midst of chaos, Singapore's diverse population, Malays, Chinese, Indians, Eurasians, and Europeans, experienced the terrifying convergence of war in different ways. Some fled into shelters, some attempted to escape by ship, and others joined local defense units or served as volunteers in firefighting brigades. Still, the Japanese continued their advance, methodically tightening the noose. Their planes roared overhead, terrorizing the population and smashing British infrastructure. Their infantry forced their way through mangrove swamps and river lines that British planners had considered natural barriers. Their artillery pounded critical water and fuel reserves, knowing that cutting off supplies would hasten the end. Singapore's rise as the British Empire's strongest bastion in the Far East was the result of decades of geopolitical planning, naval strategy, and imperial ambition. Located at the mouth of the Malacca Strait, one of the busiest maritime corridors in the world, Singapore served as the critical hinge point linking India, Southeast Asia, Australia, and China. To British strategists, whoever controlled Singapore controlled the sea lanes that sustained both imperial trade and military mobility. This belief shaped every decision made about the island, from its massive naval base to its airfields and coastal defenses. Throughout the interwar period, London invested heavily in the idea of Singapore as an impregnable fortress. Engineers constructed massive oil storage tanks, dry docks capable of servicing the largest Royal Navy battleships, and coastal gun emplacements with barrels so large they were visible from miles away. These preparations created an aura of invincibility, and newspapers across the empire proudly referred to Singapore as the Gibraltar of the East. But beneath the impressive facade lay deep vulnerabilities. The base depended on reinforcements that could only arrive if the Royal Navy freed itself from commitments in Europe. And the defensive layout assumed that any attack would come from the sea, not through the Malay Peninsula's jungles. Civilian life in Singapore during the late 1930s reflected this mix of confidence and complacency. The city bustled with merchants, dock workers, rubber traders, and colonial officials who believed that British power was permanent. Hotels along the waterfront hosted diplomats and officers, while local communities, Chinese, Malay, Indian, and Eurasian, lived under a rhythm shaped by trade and imperial administration. Yet beneath the everyday normalcy, tensions simmered as Japan expanded its influence across Asia. British intelligence reports warned that Japan's ambitions threatened Singapore's security, but government officials publicly reassured the population that the island's defenses were unbeatable. As the global situation deteriorated in 1941, Singapore's importance only grew. The British government saw the island as the anchor of its Asian defense strategy, a place where reinforcements from India and Australia could gather before engaging the Japanese. Airfields such as Tengha and Sembawang were expanded, but they remained under-equipped and lacked adequate aircraft. British planners relied heavily on outdated assumptions that Japanese forces lacked the logistical capacity to mount a large-scale, long-distance offensive. This underestimation would prove disastrous. When Japan finally entered the war, the strategic value of Singapore became a liability as much as an asset. The island transformed into a beacon of British prestige, a symbol the Japanese were determined to shatter. Every ship that docked, every convoy that passed, and every defensive plan drawn by British officers confirmed Singapore's central role in the empire's security. But while the British clung to the belief that Singapore could not fall, the Japanese prepared to challenge that myth with unprecedented speed, coordination, and ferocity. In the months to come, the so-called Gibraltar of the East would face a campaign unlike anything its designers had envisioned, revealing the fatal gap between confidence and reality.
The collapse of Malaya was not the result of a single strategic flaw, but the accumulation of decades of misjudgment, misplaced confidence, and a fundamental misunderstanding of both the terrain and the enemy. When Japan launched its invasion of Malaya on 8 December 1941, hours after striking Pearl Harbor, the British believed they possessed a strong defensive barrier. Yet this assumption unraveled almost immediately. Japanese forces, hardened by years of combat in China and supported by seasoned commanders, moved with astonishing precision. They employed a combined arms strategy that blended infantry, armor, artillery, and air power in a way British planners had not anticipated. At the same time, British and Commonwealth forces were scattered, poorly coordinated, and operating without significant air cover, which gave the Japanese almost unhindered control of the skies. The Japanese advance southward down the peninsula relied heavily on the now infamous bicycle infantry, soldiers who used simple, rugged bicycles to travel quickly along narrow jungle roads. These troops maneuvered through dense forests at a speed the British considered impossible. The British High Command had wrongly assumed the Malayan jungles were impenetrable and did not reinforce the northern defenses adequately. But the Japanese proved otherwise, bypassing strong points, infiltrating positions from unexpected angles, and disrupting communication lines. Entire battalions found themselves outflanked before a proper battle could be staged. Each engagement pushed British units further south, forcing them into hurried retreats that left equipment, ammunition, and vehicles behind. Air superiority proved decisive in the Japanese campaign. The fall of British airfields such as Kotobaru, Alarstar, and Kwantan stripped the Allies of valuable aircraft and repair facilities. RAF squadrons, already equipped with outdated planes and lacking sufficient spare parts, were forced into desperate defensive operations. Japanese aircraft, especially the Mitsubishi A6M0, dominated the skies, strafing retreating columns, bombing supply dumps, and destroying vehicles along the narrow peninsula roads. This relentless pressure shattered morale among the defending troops and made organized resistance increasingly difficult. As the Japanese swept southward, they seized key positions, including Penang, Ipoh, and Kuala Lumpur. Each loss further isolated British defenders and limited their ability to regroup. Efforts to mount counteroffensives failed due to poor coordination, lack of reconnaissance, and underestimation of Japanese strength. Australian units fought fiercely at Gamus and Moore, briefly slowing the advance, but even these valiant stands could not change the overall trajectory. Meanwhile, supply shortages grew dire. Retreating units lacked proper food, ammunition, and medical supplies. Many soldiers marched for days without rest, pursued by Japanese forces who rarely stopped moving. By January 1942, the defensive line had collapsed entirely. The British fell back toward Johor, the final staging area before Singapore. Defensive positions were hastily established, but the psychological impact of the retreat lingered heavily. The Japanese had not only proven their tactical superiority, but had also shattered the myth of British invincibility in Asia. The destruction of bridges, roads, and supply depots during the retreat created logistical chaos. When the last British units crossed the causeway from Johor into Singapore, they blew it apart, symbolically and physically severing the final link with the Malayan mainland. The road to Singapore was now clear for the Japanese. The fall of Malaya exposed every weakness in British planning: reliance on European-style warfare unsuited to tropical terrain, outdated equipment, faulty intelligence, and chronic underestimation of the Japanese military. With their confidence shaken and their forces exhausted, the defenders braced for the coming battle on the island, one that would determine the fate of Britain's greatest stronghold in the east. The Japanese, emboldened by their rapid victories, prepared for the next decisive phase, the assault on Singapore itself. The assault on Singapore began with a ferocity that shocked even those who had expected the worst. As January 1942 came to a close, the skies over the island turned into a canvas of smoke, fire, and mechanical thunder.
Japanese aircraft prowled the air, unleashing bombs that slammed into military depots, airfields, fuel reserves, and civilian districts with terrifying precision. Each explosion carved new scars across the cityscape, rattling buildings and shattering any lingering illusion that Singapore's mighty defenses could hold indefinitely. British commanders had once believed that Singapore's greatest threat would come from the sea, a conviction that had shaped its defensive network for decades. Massive naval guns pointed south toward the open waters, ready to repel any fleet approaching from the Malacca Strait. But Japan's daring advance down the Malayan peninsula proved that the real danger would come from the north, from the mainland that Britain had considered far less vulnerable. Now, as artillery units on Johor Bahru's coast opened fire across the narrow strait, the city found itself under bombardment from the very direction it was least prepared to defend. Japanese tactical doctrine relied heavily on concentrated, coordinated strikes, softening targets through relentless air power before unleashing ground forces to exploit the chaos. Bombing runs disrupted communication lines, crippled water systems, and ignited fires that raged uncontrollably in the humid wind. Military headquarters struggled to maintain cohesion as telephone wires snapped, radio equipment malfunctioned, and couriers were cut down by shrapnel. Civilians crowded into improvised shelters, sometimes sharing spaces with retreating soldiers, as both tried to comprehend the scale of the assault. The Japanese artillery barrage that followed was equally devastating. Massive guns, carefully positioned on the coast of Johor, fired shells that soared over the water and slammed into strategic locations. Ammunition stores, defensive emplacements, command bunkers, and supply depots. The constant barrage exhausted defenders who could barely sleep amid the thunderous detonations. Each shell threatened not just physical destruction, but also psychological collapse, as the reality of being outgunned and outmaneuvered settled into the minds of the exhausted Allied troops. Despite the chaos, British-led defenders mounted a determined resistance. Units from the British, Australian, Indian, and local Singaporean forces attempted to hold the northern coastline, establishing machine gun nests, digging trenches, and reinforcing pillboxes. But the Japanese, moving with practiced efficiency, identified weak points in the defensive perimeter. Their infiltration tactics, perfected in earlier campaigns, allowed small teams to slip through dense vegetation or cross narrow water channels at night. These units marked targets for artillery and guided infantry toward gaps in the Allied lines. On the night of February 8, 1942, the Japanese launched their major amphibious assault on Singapore Island. Under cover of darkness and heavy bombardment, thousands of soldiers crossed the Johor Strait in collapsible boats, landing on the island's northwest shores. The region, defended primarily by the Australian 22nd Brigade, quickly became a battleground of confusion, smoke, and shifting front lines. Japanese troops fanned out quickly, using jungle cover to outflank defenders and overwhelm isolated strongpoints. Though the Australians fought bravely, they faced overwhelming odds. Communications failures, unexpected enemy mobility, and misinterpreted battlefield reports created gaps that widened into critical breaches. Japanese troops pushed inland rapidly, capturing key junctions and severing the defenders' ability to coordinate counterattacks. As more Japanese divisions made landfall, the Allied command realized that the northern defense line was collapsing faster than anticipated. Inside the city, panic began to spread. Civilians, hearing the distant rumble of gunfire growing closer, packed what belongings they could and fled to basements, churches, theaters, and underground shelters. Many had nowhere to go, trapped on an island with no escape route. The British military command, meanwhile, scrambled to reposition forces, shifting units from the south and central regions in a desperate attempt to plug the widening northern breach. Japanese troops pressed deeper, seizing reservoirs that supplied the city's water, a strategic move that placed immense pressure on British commanders. Without secured water supplies, Singapore could not sustain a prolonged battle. The Japanese attack was not merely a physical assault, but an attempt to strangle the island's capacity to survive. By February 10th, the Japanese breakthrough was undeniable. Defensive lines once thought unassailable had fractured beyond repair. The city's infrastructure lay in ruins, morale was crumbling, and the enemy was advancing with relentless momentum. The bombardment had not just softened the island, it had shattered the foundation upon which the British command had staked Singapore's security. As the Japanese breakthrough deepened across Singapore Island, the final phase of the battle unfolded with a sense of grim inevitability. The defenders, exhausted, undersupplied, and outmaneuvered, were forced into a shrinking perimeter around the city. What had once been the British Empire's proud fortress in the east was now a battlefield of firestorms, collapsing buildings, and desperate last stands. Smoke from burning fuel depots drifted through the streets, and the distant rumble of artillery grew louder with each passing hour, a reminder that the enemy was closing in from every direction. General Arthur Percival, commander of the British forces, faced an impossible crisis. His troops were scattered, morale was dangerously low, and communication systems were breaking down faster than they could be repaired. Water supplies were running dangerously short after the Japanese seized key reservoirs, and the city's remaining infrastructure was on the verge of collapse. Hospitals overflowed with wounded soldiers and civilians, many of them lying on floors due to lack of beds. Doctors worked around the clock, often without electricity, making do with dwindling supplies of medicine and bandages. The Japanese, under General Tomoyuki Yamashita, maintained relentless pressure. Their encirclement tightened as they seized vital crossroads, bombarded defensive strongholds, and infiltrated deep into Allied lines. Yamashita understood the psychological value of speed and uncertainty. Each night his forces pushed aggressively, forcing British units to retreat before they could reorganize. The island's once formidable defenses had become liabilities, bunkers without ammunition, pillboxes outflanked by jungle-trained infantry, and artillery positions deprived of clear lines of fire. Civilians trapped in the midst of the fighting endured unimaginable hardship. Entire neighborhoods were reduced to rubble under artillery and aerial bombardment. In makeshift shelters, subway tunnels, church basements, warehouses, families huddled together, praying for the shelling to stop. Many suffered from dehydration as municipal systems failed, while food shortages grew increasingly severe. Long lines formed outside emergency kitchens as volunteers attempted to feed the thousands uprooted by the fighting. Panic, though widespread, eventually hardened into resignation. There was no escape, no reinforcements coming, and no path to evacuation. Within the military ranks, the situation deteriorated quickly. Units were forced into piecemeal withdrawals, some retreating under fire without adequate cover. Commanders struggled to maintain cohesion among troops who had been fighting nearly non-stop for weeks. Reports poured in of ammunition running dangerously low, machine guns rendered inactive from overheating, and infantry platoons reduced to a fraction of their original strength. Many soldiers went into battle holding rifles with only a few rounds left, knowing reinforcements were impossible. The Japanese, sensing the defenders' weakness, executed a series of coordinated assaults designed to force a rapid surrender. Artillery batteries rained shells onto key defensive nodes. Fighters strafed roads used for troop movement. Infantry and tank units advanced methodically, capturing waterworks, supply warehouses, and communication hubs. What had once been pockets of resistance became isolated encampments, each fighting without knowledge of the larger battle unfolding around them. The most devastating moment came when the Bukit Timah area, home to vital fuel and ammunition depots, fell to the Japanese. Its loss crippled the British ability to continue meaningful resistance. Percival convened emergency meetings with his senior officers, all of whom agreed that the situation was untenable. The city had no water, no supplies, and no hope of relief. Continuing the fight would only result in catastrophic casualties among both soldiers and civilians. General Yamashita, however, was also under pressure. His troops were exhausted, ammunition stocks were running low, and his supply lines were stretched thin. But he maintained the illusion of overwhelming strength, a psychological tactic meant to force Percival's hand. He issued an ultimatum: immediate surrender or Singapore would be destroyed. On February 15, 1942, after hours of deliberation, General Percival made the painful decision to meet Yamashita and negotiate terms. The meeting, held at the Ford Motor Factory in Bukatima, became one of the most symbolic encounters of the war. Percival, visibly exhausted and burdened by responsibility, faced Yamashita, who demanded unconditional surrender. That afternoon, the order was given. White flags appeared across surviving British positions. The guns fell silent. After 70 days of fierce fighting across the Malayan Peninsula and a week of chaos on the island, Singapore, the Gibraltar of the East, had fallen. The surrender was the largest capitulation in British military history. More than 80,000 troops became prisoners of war, joining the 50,000 already captured in Malaya. The humiliation was profound, and its consequences were far-reaching. For the men who had fought desperately in the city's final hours, the surrender marked not relief, but the beginning of new ordeals under Japanese captivity. The fall of Singapore on February 15, 1942, sent shockwaves across the world. In London, the news was met with disbelief. Singapore had long been heralded as the British Empire's strongest fortress in Asia, a symbol of imperial authority and military dominance. Its sudden collapse shattered that illusion. The consequences were immediate, far-reaching, and, in many ways, irreversible. The defeat did not merely signal the loss of a strategic stronghold, it marked the beginning of the end for the British Empire in Asia. In the immediate aftermath, more than 80,000 Allied soldiers, British, Australian, Indian, and local volunteers, were marched into Japanese captivity. Their ordeal would become one of the darkest chapters of the war. Prisoners of war were subjected to brutal conditions, forced labor, starvation, and relentless punishment. Many were transported to work on the infamous Burma-Thailand Railway, known as the Death Railway, where thousands perished from disease, exhaustion, and abuse. Others were sent to camps across Southeast Asia and Japan, scattered far from the land they had fought to defend. Civilians in Singapore faced their own hardships. Under Japanese occupation, the island was renamed Shonantoi, meaning Light of the South, though for its inhabitants the new era brought anything but illumination. Strict curfews, food rationing, and widespread fear became daily realities. The Kempeitai, the Japanese military police, enforced rule through intimidation and violence. Suspected resistance members, local leaders, and entire communities, particularly among the Chinese population, suffered brutal reprisals. The Sukcheng massacre, carried out in the weeks following the surrender, claimed the lives of thousands of Chinese civilians, leaving a deep scar on Singapore's collective memory. For Japan, the capture of Singapore represented one of its greatest strategic triumphs. The victory secured control over vital sea routes in Southeast Asia and crippled Allied influence in the region. It provided the Japanese military with a base to launch further operations throughout the Dutch East Indies and toward Burma. The psychological impact was equally significant. Japan had defeated the seemingly invincible British Empire, proving that Western colonial powers were no longer unassailable. This emboldened nationalist movements throughout Asia, inspiring aspirations of independence that would shape the post-war world. In Britain, the fall of Singapore forced a reckoning. Prime Minister Churchill called it the worst disaster and largest capitulation in British history. Public confidence in imperial leadership was shaken, and policymakers were compelled to confront the vulnerabilities of their global defense strategy. The defeat exposed major flaws in military planning, intelligence coordination, and logistical readiness. Overconfidence in outdated assumptions, such as the belief that Singapore was impregnable from the sea or that Japan would not dare mount a full-scale offensive, had contributed to catastrophic misjudgments. The legacy of the defeat extended well beyond the war. In the years following the Japanese surrender in 1945, the people of Singapore began to question the foundations of British rule. The wartime experience galvanized a new sense of national identity and accelerated the push for self-government. The British, weakened by the war and facing growing demands for independence across their empire, gradually dismantled their colonial administration. By 1959, Singapore achieved self-government and in 1965, full independence as a sovereign nation. The fall of Singapore, once a symbol of British decline, became, in hindsight, a catalyst for the island's eventual transformation into a modern and resilient state. For military historians, the battle remains a case study in strategic failure. The British miscalculated the mobility and audacity of the Japanese army, underestimated their ability to wage war in tropical terrain, and relied too heavily on outdated assumptions. The Japanese, on the contrary, exploited speed, surprise, and adaptability. Their victory demonstrated the effectiveness of coordinated air, naval, and ground strategies, an early example of modern blitz-style warfare in the Pacific. Yet the legacy is not one of defeat alone. The bravery of soldiers and civilians during the final days of the battle continues to be honored in Singapore and throughout the Commonwealth. Memorials, museums, and preserved wartime sites remind future generations of the sacrifices made and the lessons learned. The events of 1942 serve as a solemn reminder of the dangers of complacency, the cost of underestimating an adversary, and the human suffering that war brings.